Welcome to Mind Tricks Radio, where we'll explore contemporary topics in psychology through interviewing creative and innovative thinkers in the field. I'm your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan. Thanks for tuning in. We're here today with Dr. Joseph Pierre, a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He has extensive clinical experience working with individuals with psychotic disorders, substance abuse, and those with dual diagnosis. He's authored over 100 papers, abstracts, and book chapters related to schizophrenia, antipsychotic medication, substance abuse psychosis, delusions and delusion-like beliefs, and auditory hallucinations. Most recently, he's published the book False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. He's also the author of the Psych Unseen blog at Psychology Today, where he writes about the psychology of false belief. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. It's great to see you. The last time we met was, I think, during the heart of the COVID pandemic, and we had a lot to talk about, I think, because of things that were going on at the time and some of your writings about false beliefs. That was a super interesting episode. It's been very popular amongst listeners. Between then and now, you've been a pretty busy man. You've written this book. It's called False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. And after reading that, wow, what a intense, fascinating, and frankly, a little bit scary, some of the things you talk about, but kind of in a good way, I must say. Well, let's just start with that. Like, I know that you're into this subject matter because I interviewed you about this type of thing a couple of years ago, but how did you come about to write False? And tell us a little bit about the content of it and what brought you to write it.
Yeah, well, thanks. I'd be happy to. Well, first of all, for listeners, I'll remind people who don't know me from the previous episode that I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a full-time clinician, typically work with hospitalized patients, and my interest in psychiatry through the years has really been on the treatment of people with psychosis and psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. And of the symptoms of schizophrenia or psychosis that have always most intrigued me, the one at the top of the list is delusions, which are these fixed false beliefs that often have these sort of fantastical qualities. So like the belief that somebody believes that they're the second coming of Christ, or that they were abducted by space aliens, or that they have magical powers and this sort of thing. And I've always just wondered, what happens in someone's head that would allow them to have those kinds of beliefs that are so divorced from reality. So that's my clinical work, but my academic work has often focused on what I refer to as the gray area between psychopathology and normality. And right now, in the time that we're living in now, I think it's pretty clear that seemingly normal people without obvious mental illness also tend to have these very strongly held beliefs about things that sometimes are even demonstrably untrue. Now, I could get into the fine details of why I wouldn't consider some of those things to be delusions, but nonetheless, it is striking that people have those kinds of false beliefs. And in psychiatry, we often kind of just explain away those delusions by just saying, oh, well, the person's psychotic, the person has schizophrenia, or even if we're dealing with someone with depression who has cognitive distortions like the idea that I'm an ugly person, or I'm not attractive, or I'm not popular. That's those sort of self-deprecating thoughts. Well, we say, well, those are happening because the person's depressed. And what I didn't see a good account of in books and other media was a way to explain why normal people like you and me also have these false beliefs, despite the fact that mental illness isn't really part of that. So that's a long-winded explanation for why I set out to write that book. I just didn't really feel like there was anything out there that explained it, and I was trying to pull together all the research and put it in one place for people.
Yeah, and you did a great job with that, and we'll be talking a lot about the content of the book as we go. I've got to say, I read a lot of books, Joe, and I love reading. And usually the way a lot of books in the psychology field go is the first few chapters are just packed really densely with kind of like the meat of the subject matter. And then the rest of the book is sort of illustrations of the first few chapters. But your book was sort of like meat all of the way
Hmm.
through. It was pretty intense. So we're going to get into some of the various parts of it. But again, good job on writing it because you obviously put a lot of time and thought into it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I do a little fiction writing on the side, and when I write longer pieces, I always try to have it be cohesive, but also have each chapter be almost like a short story. And so that's what I tried to do in the book, to kind of tackle one topic over another in different chapters, but also make it a cohesive whole.
Yeah, well, that certainly came through that way. So, just to start with, I think it might be very helpful to just spend a few moments talking about defining the difference between, say, a delusion, which you say, we talk a lot about in a clinical psychiatry practice, and a false belief. And what sort of like at the basic level, how do you differentiate the two things?
Yeah, so, I'll start by saying that the guidelines aren't super clear. If you look at the DSM, right, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that psychiatrists and other mental health professionals use for diagnosis, it has criteria for the different psychotic disorders. And one of those criteria is delusions. Well, then you have to go to the glossary to see what the definition of a delusion is. But as I said, it mostly has to do with having a fixed, meaning a belief held with very strong conviction, and a false belief. So suggesting that there's evidence to the contrary. But one of the things that's always intrigued me about delusions is that there are many types of beliefs that we have that aren't really falsifiable, right? Oftentimes, those beliefs extend into the religious realm, for example, or the metaphysical realm. What happens when we die? Is there a God? And we do think that people have religious delusions. So in fact, one of my first papers years ago was getting at how do we distinguish religious beliefs from religious delusions. So anyway, some of the pointers that I give to clinicians is that when we talk about clinical delusions of the type that I mentioned, they are usually beliefs about the believer rather than beliefs about the world. So I call that self-referentiality. The belief refers to the person doing the believing. And the evidence to support that belief is usually some sort of internal subjective experience. So if I believe that I'm the second coming of Christ, well, that was because I had this dream last night. And in the dream, God came to me and spoke to me and told me that I was the second coming of Christ, right? So that's idiosyncratic. That's largely going to be an unshared belief. And it's based on this internal subjective experience. The other kind of beliefs that I'm really focusing on the book are things like, for example, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are beliefs about the world. They're not typically believed because of some internal subjective experience. They're believed because people have gone online or wherever, read a book and said, well, I read that this is true. JFK wasn't killed by a lone gunman. I've read a movie, or I watched the Oliver Stone movie, or that sort of thing. So the evidence is based on information that's out there in the world. And conspiracy theories, as an example of these kinds of false beliefs, are often widely held. Actually, if you look at polls, the majority of the population will believe in at least one conspiracy theory. Whereas delusions, even though there is such a thing as a shared delusion, that's relatively rare. Usually delusions are idiosyncratic and not shared beliefs. So those are some of the types of sort of guideposts that I use, although there can also be overlap. People can have conspiracy theory beliefs about the world while also having an individual delusion or a self-referential belief.
Is there some kind of a threshold where a false belief or bordering into conspiracy theory we would consider pathological from a psychiatric standpoint, or where's the boundary there?
Yeah, such a good question. Also a difficult one to answer. I actually recently wrote an entire paper on that very topic, and sort of gets into the weeds. There's this sort of popular saying out there that says something about, insanity is just a normal reaction to an insane society. And, I don't think that's a good explanation for mental illness. I think that ignores a lot of what we know about mental illness and what might cause it, genetically or biologically or otherwise. But I think it raises an interesting point when we start talking about things like conspiracy theories or other types of false beliefs. And, what you'll see in the book is that I make the case for something that since I've written the book, I now call the 3M model, meaning that some of the core features to explain false beliefs are mistrust in the information that's out there. Mistrust in the information that's out there. The second M would be misinformation, so that when we mistrust authoritative sources or mainstream accounts, we then turn to these counter narratives and we run into misinformation. And the third is motivated reasoning, which gets into like, why do we believe this versus that based on our ideological affiliations? So those are kind of some of the things that help us distinguish between those kind of beliefs and where does the evidence come from? Why does someone have that kind of thought?
I'd like to talk a little bit about cognitive errors that we see commonly in the way people think. And of course, as a psychologist, I do psychotherapy, quite a bit of cognitive behavioral therapy. We look a lot at irrational thinking, which includes cognitive biases, cognitive errors. In fact, I done quite a number of episodes of my podcast where I talk about different types of cognitive distortions that people typically have. And I know that these cognitive biases are obviously common in this idea of false beliefs and what you talk about. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ones that you really mentioned are big ones in the subject of the book that you wrote: confirmation bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Are any of those kind of the most insidious, or tell us what you think about these and how they're relevant to this discussion?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that I think it's in the second chapter, I do cover this interesting topic of what we call positive illusions, which are, you could sort of call them cognitive distortions, but they're actually associated with positive effects on mental health. So the classic one is something called the better than average effect, the idea that most of us actually think that we're better than average, although statistically, that's not really possible. And as you might imagine, yeah, maybe that's associated with greater self-esteem or more positive self-regard, and maybe that might make you more confident to succeed in life. And so one of the points I make in the book, and a sort of follow-up to what you had asked earlier, which is that we often think of beliefs as this sort of all or none phenomenon. You either believe this or you don't, right? A kind of black and white kind of way of thinking. But really, and you know this very well as a therapist doing CBT, beliefs can really be quantified, right? How much do we believe? How much time do we spend believing? And that really, I think, gives us some hints about pathology, for example. So there can be these positive illusions, but I think sometimes they can get to a point quantitatively where they're excessive, right? If you go from just feeling better than average to feeling like, well, I'm really special and I'm awesome, and then you start to lord that over, the people well, that's going to go south really quickly. And then, that's where we sort of intrude into narcissism. So I'm bringing up the idea that sometimes it's the degree rather than the belief or the bias. And when we talk about cognitive biases, everyone has them, right? No one is immune from cognitive biases. So again, it's a question of like, how much does this particular cognitive bias affect you and your belief? So in the book, I make the case for one of the most important cognitive biases being confirmation bias, which you mentioned. So I feel like that's almost become a household word at this point. But what it basically means is it describes what we do when we encounter information or when we're looking for information, which is that if we have some preconceived idea or preconceived belief, or even if we want to believe something, then when we go looking for answers, we tend to bias ourselves and select the information that reinforces or supports what we already believe or what we want to believe. And then if we see information that doesn't support it or contradicts it, then we tend to ignore that or swipe past it. And the reason I make a big deal of that is because, again, in this thing that I'm calling the 3M model, where there's mistrust and misinformation, so we're already, because of our brains, biased towards selecting information that helps us select information that supports what we believe. But once we're, especially in an online space, well, then the algorithms that are present in online spaces, whether it's search engines or social media sites like YouTube, they're actually also designed to feed us the information that the algorithms, quote unquote, think that we want to see, because, right, that's sort of how they generate, money, by getting us to click on things. So I refer to that as confirmation bias on steroids. Our brains are already primed to seek out information that reinforces what we believe. But when we interact with something like Google, or any other search engine, oftentimes then that really gets amped up all the more. And I think that does help. On the one hand, I don't want to blame everything, bad in the world on the internet, but I do think that the way we get information over the past several decades has profoundly changed, and it can lead to this sort of reinforcement of belief instead of really being able to critically look at information and decide what's truthful or not, and be really better consumers of the information that's out there.
Sure. Well, that idea of the confirmation bias on steroids is really clear in the internet because you literally can search for anything you want at your fingertips that will confirm your bias. And that might have been a little harder to do before the internet because you'd have to search out individual people who are willing to confirm it,
Yeah.
like talking in the some dark basement with a little dangling light and talking about your conspiracies or your thoughts. Now it's just available everywhere you look.
Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit more about that later too, because I want to dig into the internet a bit more. But let's you talk about something called the bias blind spot. Just real quick, that idea about seeing others' biases more clearly than your own. How does that fit into this?
Yeah, I mean, that's really a point that I try to make throughout the book, right? We're living in a time where this issue of why people believe things that isn't true is really quite timely, right? I would argue that it's profoundly affecting what's happening in the world, whether it's public policy or who wins elections and these sorts of things. So I feel like that's a really important topic. But what I think we also tend to do, why is the question, why do people believe things that aren't true, interesting? Well, it's mostly interesting because people are always wondering about those other people who have these false beliefs and trying to understand, like, how could they believe something like so ridiculous? But the bias blind spot, it highlights that we're very good at pointing out the foibles of other people, particularly those who disagree with us, and we're not very good at seeing them in ourselves. And so again, throughout the book, I really try to make the point that, look, these are universal biases, these are universal pitfalls, so that we're all vulnerable to false belief. Now, having said that, there are quantitative differences. Some of us, for certain reasons, might be more prone to false beliefs than others. And that's really where the misinformation and the motivated reasoning piece come in. And of course, in the book, I do get into politics and other topics where really some of what people believe is dictated by the information within the informational ecosystems that they're navigating.
You call that the misinformation marketplace. You've got some great buzzwords, by the way. The misinformation marketplace, and you call the internet a flea market of opinion, which is a pretty vivid metaphor. Let's talk a little bit more about the internet. Can you say a bit more about, well, just the concept of misinformation, disinformation, and how people access that and are influenced by it, and how the internet ties into that?
Yeah, well, in the book, I talk about my sort of own life experience where, when I was growing up decades ago, we had these things called libraries that we used.
Yeah, yeah, I remember them.
Yeah, and these things called books or encyclopedias, and we didn't have the internet. And for that matter, we had what, four network television stations, with rabbit ear TVs, and most families, I think back then, subscribed to like the local newspaper or the major city newspaper. And so it was a very simple world back then. And I'm not suggesting that's better, right? I think in theory, it's better that we have this much, much more diverse source of information now. In theory, though, I think the hope was that with all that information, you would have the truth sort of rise to the top, right? That it would be better to discern the truth. And unfortunately, for a variety of different reasons, now we just have this sort of chaotic mess of information out there. And meanwhile, we haven't really, I believe, haven't really been taught how to navigate it. Do we teach kids in school how to find good information versus bad, reliable news versus not? How do you separate opinions from facts or evidence? I mean, it's really difficult to navigate that. And so I think, on the one side, it's great. It's great to have so many diverse voices out there. But on the downside, there is a lot of misinformation out there. So just to answer your question and restate some terms, misinformation simply means information that's false or not accurate. Disinformation usually refers to deliberate misinformation. Somebody's putting out that content despite the fact that they know that it's true. And in the book, I certainly take Alex Jones to task as a good example of that. Someone who has profited, made an entire career and celebrity and millions of dollars basically off of disseminating misinformation. So that's part of why misinformation's out there. It's actually a pretty good way to attract attention and to attract clicks. In fact, there's evidence that it's a better way to attract attention. And that's where I come up with the metaphor of the flea market, right? In theory, you would have a free market, FREE market, where the best information would rise to the top. But instead, we have this flea market where it's the loudest, most raucous, salacious news or information that captures our attention. And so I think that's sort of the environment that we navigate today.
Right. And in fact, you mentioned earlier that people, kids maybe, are not learning how to distinguish misinformation from true information and navigating just this marketplace of information out there in the internet. And you had said earlier briefly that actually the internet often does that for us by coming up with algorithms to feed us the information that it thinks we're most likely to be interested in consuming. So that in and of itself becomes a problem in gathering information and forming conclusions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think we all might have some personal experience with this. Not too long ago, a family member of mine was having surgery for hernia repair. And, I'm a medical doctor, so I, was looking into, what that involves and, what a mesh is. And so I did do a Google search or some online engine search to learn about meshes, and I found some good information. But what happened shortly thereafter is suddenly my social media feeds were inundated with ads about lawsuits against medical companies making meshes and that sort of thing. So that's a good example of how, and we've all had that experience where you go shopping for something and now the ads for that thing are popping up everywhere. You're buying a new car and now car ads. So those algorithms really do steer us to information based on our previous searches.
That's a perfect example, the lawsuit one. Like, let's say you started seeing all of these ads come up about lawsuits about meshes or whatever it is. You might be inclined to go out and sort of start telling everybody this surgical procedure is dangerous. Don't do it. And this is the danger of doing it, having this medical device or whatever put inside your body. It's a high likelihood of leading to a complication or a problem just because you're being fed this kind of information. And you may not get the surgery. You might tell other people not to do it. That could be a problem.
Right. So I sometimes I call this the tale of two alternate realities. We know that if I got onto your computer and did a Google search and you got into mine, if we put in a search term, we might get very different results based on our previous experience. So absolutely, those algorithms can steer us towards information that's not accurate because it's trying to reinforce the previous searches we've done and give us what it thinks that we need.
What is this illusory truth effect? It has something to do with repetition of falsehoods.
Yeah, that's basically it. So the illusory truth effect is a pretty robust finding where the more you hear something like a statement or some sorts of information, the more you believe it. And that's independent of whether or not the veracity of the statement. So even, if you hear lies or outright truths again and again and again, you tend to believe them to some degree. Interestingly, that effect happens sometimes despite sort of having some sense that the source of information is unreliable. So there really is something about the repetition aspect that it's sort of in our brain. For example, a lot of polls about conspiracy theories will ask not only, do you believe XYZ, but they'll also ask, have you heard about XYZ? And I think sometimes like the more you hear that somebody believes it, then that actually does tend to soften us somehow and go, well, maybe that is true if I hear it so often. And, without getting into politics too much, there are some politicians who are really, really good at that,
Yeah.
using these short, simple phrases again and again and again, that it's like it's so much in the consciousness, even though there's part of you like, as well, I don't believe that, but like it's an idea that's out there and I know people believe it. So yeah, maybe it's true. So that's
Or
really the illusory truth effect.
or like if there's a political, I'm just going to make this up for illustrative purposes, but if you have a political opponent, for example, and you call them monkey brain over and over and over and over again, eventually, even if you like that particular political opponent that they're calling monkey brain, you might start associating that person with monkey brain, right? It's just sort of repeating something that's not true again and again and again. It sinks in. That's the whole point of advertising, right? Get my brand out as much as I possibly can so
Yeah.
people remember it and they start associating it with what I want them to associate it with.
Yep, that's exactly right. And thanks for bringing up the point about advertising, because I really think that that's where things started, right? Is using psychological principles basically for purposes of making money and figuring out through market research and that sort of thing, consumer research, finding out, how do I get people's attention and how do I shift their beliefs and opinions about things, right? If I'm Coke, how do I get people to think that Pepsi's terrible or vice versa? And there's so many catchy phrases that, I even remember from 40 years ago when I was a kid that are still in my brain about certain products. And that's exactly what we're talking about, this idea of repetition just gets it in there, whether or not that thing is true or not.
You talk in your book about some really interesting stuff having to do with language trends and research that I think is pretty interesting. You talk about this idea about intuitive words like feel and believe. They've kind of overtaken rational words like data and analyze in literature and journalism. You talk about this quite a bit, and I think it's really interesting, this I believe rather than we conclude. Can you say a little bit about this and why this is important?
Yeah, I mean, that's based on some specific research that I do have cited in the book. I don't remember who the authors are offhand, but they basically looked at what you're saying. They looked at statements in the media, in op-eds, those kind of informational sources. And what they saw is that there has been a shift over the past several decades where, as you're saying, there's been a shift towards more individual, I believe kind of statements. I think rather than we conclude. So instead, it seems like a shift away from a kind of more empiric or scientific kind of thinking, the way we arrive at facts, in favor of this more opinion-based belief. And Stephen Colbert coined this term truthiness, so that's part of that. You mentioned intuition. Well, truthiness, Stephen Colbert says, is like belief in something because it feels good. And that, I think, again, is sort of the trend that we see with language, that people use that to justify their beliefs. There's this certain phrase that I hear from time to time, like believe in your personal truth. And I always struggle with that because, sure, our own personal subjective experience is important. I could have experiences that you don't have, and those are valid. But the idea that there's like a personal truth and not this universal truth, I think there is a shift, away from that idea of shared reality to now we have these sort of different versions of reality. And of course, in the book, I do talk about the idea of, so-called alternative facts, right? This idea that it's not just opinions and you have a difference of opinion, but like, no, I fundamentally just say that what you're saying isn't true, and my fact is just as valid as yours. And so that's what we're getting at when we talk about that shift in language.
Yeah, I think you even see that a lot in the way the news media goes about gathering stories. I don't know if you've experienced this or even if you would agree with this, but I've just noticed over the last couple of decades that when reporters are out reporting on some kind of event or something that's happening, what they're often spending most of their time doing is asking bystanders or people around there how they're feeling or comment about the mood of the situation or what the sort of the kind of what an environment feels like, and it's less about facts and more about getting people's impressions of how they feel about what's going on. And it sort of strikes me that maybe that's sort of an example of the direction we're going in terms of the way we talk about things happening in the world around us.
Yeah, I mean, it almost is like the media, including not just internet, but across the board. It's almost like it's sort of catering to a kind of ADHD mentality, right? It's like we are barraged and inundated with so many informational sources. Like, how many of us these days read long form journalism? I mean, I subscribe to some things that have long articles, but they tend to pile up. And, I would like wish I could have several days off and sit down and read them. Instead, what we're doing is we got that phone in front of our hands, and it's always about the quick soundbite. And that, unfortunately, is how media generates income, as I said, revenue, by attracting those clicks so that they can then sell ads, to people who are watching. So it really has, I think, shifted from an informational environment where we want the quick, easy, snappy headline. And then, yes, there's so much now in opinion rather than sort of sober news analysis. I mean, even that phrase, sober news analysis, like who wants to listen to that, right? It just sounds so boring.
Yeah.
Uh, and yet, if you're really trying to delve into a subject and understand what's going on, like you really need that kind of in-depth objective journalism to really understand what's happening.
Let's talk a little bit about the way that facts and information are consumed. And this is this idea of like the role of identity and tribalism. It seems to me in your book, you talk about people becoming more polarized in our culture and that their polarization centers more around their sense of identity.
Yeah, I mean, that's where motivated reasoning comes in. So we talked about confirmation bias, which is this way that we gravitate towards one type of information that reinforces what our belief and we ignore the other. Motivated reasoning takes things one step beyond that. So that describes what we do when we actually do engage with the information, read an article, watch a video, that kind of thing, which is similar to confirmation bias, meaning that when we engage with it, if it again reinforces what we believe or want to believe, then we tend to say, see, this is like a great article. And this is a wonderful news team, or this is a good reporter, right? This is good information. And then when you actually do take the time to read the other information that contradicts what you say, then we say, well, this is a flawed study, this is biased, this is, partisan, and we just discount it. So what that does is it tends to reinforce our identities, which are often, there is this sort of what I call fusion of identity and belief, where a lot of our identities are actually based on belief. And this is something that has also shifted. If you look, for example, at political polarization, and you look several decades ago, there was much more ideological overlap between conservatives and liberals or Republicans and Democrats, meaning that there were many topics where they had shared concerns and, identified them as, yes, this is something we should be working on in a country, even something like immigration, for example. Now it's much more polarized, where it's pretty much to the extent that assuming you do affiliate with a political party, I can pretty much tell you what you believe, right? I know where you stand on immigration. I know where you stand on gun control. I know where you stand on climate change, right? And that really is the motivated reasoning piece. We've evolved into this sort of politically polarized environment where the types of beliefs that we have are much more separated. There's not that same degree of overlap. And when we equate our identity with those beliefs, then that can be very difficult and tricky, because if we feel like somebody's challenging our beliefs, well, then that's experienced as like a personal attack. That's an attack on me, not just my beliefs, when we have that kind of belief identity fusion. And I think this plays out all the time in places like social media. I've been guilty of it myself, where I'll get into some argument with, some person, or who knows, maybe it's a chat bot. I don't even know if it's a real person, but it kind of it really gets you, and you like want to argue with them, and you want to show you're right, and that sort of thing. And it's because, again, when those beliefs become aspects of your identity, we tend to defend them very vigorously.
So the idea is sort of like if I identify with a particular group, a political party, or some kind of a social group or community, and somebody disagrees with something that I'm saying, it's sort of challenging my identity as a person within this group. And it becomes more about me feeling like I need to fiercely defend my point because I'm defending my identity, as opposed to just talking about the specific point that there might be a difference about. Is that sort of kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it, but I also think what it helps to explain is this phenomenon that we see where people will have those strong beliefs about a given topic. Just I'll pick an example out of a hat, that among conservatives now, or in the Republican Party, there's this big backlash against like wokeism, right? Even something, that we saw back when Trump was first running against Clinton, this idea of socialism. socialism has taken root and we need to fight socialism. So like that's a belief, right? A belief that socialism is overtaking America, wokeism is overtaking America, and that's, leading us down a bad path. But then if you ask people who say those things, well, what is socialism? The half the time they can't explain it. What is wokeism?
Right.
They don't really know. So that's part of it. When we talk about motivated reasoning, it's like we know based on our group affiliation what we're supposed to believe. Wokeism is bad if I'm a conservative. Conservative, communism's bad, socialism's bad. But can you actually explain what those are? No. So it's really a belief based on the fact that that when you're on this team, this is what you're supposed to believe.
Joe, let's talk about what you describe as the holy trinity of truth detection. And you talk about these very important concepts: intellectual humility, cognitive flexibility, and analytical thinking. Could you talk a little bit about these and why they're so important to truth?
Yeah, for sure. So, apologies to my Catholic upbringing. Very irreverent of me to call it the Holy Trinity of truth detection. But nonetheless, what I try in the later chapters to not end on too pessimistic a note. I mean, I do think there's some real challenges ahead with regard to this topic of false belief, but I do think there's ways out of it. And similar to what I'd said before, I think the first step is not to just assume that it's only these other people that have false beliefs and these other people that have the cognitive biases or the other people who are just, the ones reading misinformation. We have to really start by looking at ourselves. And so that's where this Holy Trinity comes in, right? So as you mentioned, the three components are cognitive flexibility, meaning that you and I can have a conversation. I can hear your perspective. I can listen, sympathetically and say, oh, I can see where you're coming from. And I might not believe that, but, I can understand that. Or, maybe we have a dialogue or you point me to some informational sources and I say, you know what, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I can modify my beliefs. That's the intellectual humility piece, right? The idea that, well, I don't believe that I'm 100% right about every single thing, right? Only the most arrogant person would be able to really, make that claim. And so that means we should be more open to modifying our beliefs. And then the third component is analytical thinking, which I feel like is always kind of misunderstood or mischaracterized. The other phrase I hear a lot is critical thinking, right? Like the problem in the US now or in the world right now is a lack of critical thinking skills, which, okay, maybe that's part of the picture. But when I talk about analytical thinking, I'm talking about research that supports that one of the best ways to not succumb to misinformation is simply to kind of slow down for a second or pump the brakes when we encounter information and think to ourselves, you know what, this information might not be right. So before I decide it's true, or before I, share it or retweet it or whatever, I'll actually read the piece, right? Number one. And number two, kind of go into some details to say, well, yeah, actually the source they're talking about isn't very reliable. I mean, I'll give you an example so that I'm not just talking about, Republicans bad kind of thing, right? The US Surgeon General nominee that Trump made this week, if you read the headline that I saw, it said that the new Surgeon General nominee Trump pick doesn't have a medical degree. So if you actually click on the article, what you'll see is that this person did in fact go to medical school. And if you go to medical school, that means you get a medical degree, get an MD. What happened though is this person then dropped out of residency training, decided really not to pursue medicine as a vocation, and became a self-described wellness influencer. So, I mean, that to me is a pretty big deal and seems like a terrible choice for somebody to be the US Surgeon General. But on the other hand, it's not true that she doesn't have a medical degree. And when I first saw that, I saw the headline and I was appalled. I'm like, what? We're going to have a surgeon general who doesn't? And then I kind of read the article and I said, wait a minute. And then I, looked up more information about it. And then I said, aha, see, actually, that's not right. So that's really what analytical thinking is. It's rather than, just grabbing that information and sharing it because, yeah, it shows, what an idiot Trump is and how bad a job he's doing. I said, no, like let's actually analyze and let's look at that. So that's the third piece.
Yeah. You talk about this cognitive reflection test, Joe. That's with a bat and ball. And as kind of part of all of this, could you just briefly mention what's meant by that?
Yeah, well, that is how researchers, when they're measuring analytical thinking, quantify it using this thing called the CRT or the cognitive reflection test. And there's a couple different versions, and they include different questions that gauge your ability to engage in analytical thinking. So I don't remember the math problem offhand, but it basically has something to do with, you have this amount of money and this amount of money, and you subtract. And intuitively, just the way the question is answered, if you kind of jump and guess at the answer, it's actually wrong. You have to kind of really think through it a little bit more slow paced in the way that I said. So that's sort of the way that researchers quantify that degree, that propensity to be able to slow down and not succumb to the easy, seemingly obvious answer, which is it's sort of a trap or a trick, actually.
One interesting direction you go is this idea of truth versus free speech and freedom of speech. And there's sort of a fine line there between this idea of content moderation and censorship. And we see this a lot in the social media, and this has come up a lot, obviously, with Twitter or X and Elon Musk, and the spread of misinformation versus freedom of speech. And it's kind of a complicated, difficult subject to kind of navigate through. And I'm just curious about some of your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it is a very tricky one. And I think we've seen, in the past decade, very interesting, I'm going to call them strategies, in terms of the use of those kind of words that we've talked about. Even something like fake news. I mean, fake news started as a term because there did indeed seem to be misinformation out there. But then, I don't want to mention Trump too many times during this discussion, but Trump sort of jumped on that and he started talking about other sources of information as fake news. And now even misinformation has become this term that, I think there is such a thing as misinformation. There's information that's not correct. But then oftentimes the people putting out the misinformation say, well, I'm not the misinformation, right? That source is misinformation. So it's become this sort of like name calling, right? And some people have said, well, misinformation is just a term people use to describe, beliefs that don't agree with what they think.
Yeah.
But of course, in the book, I make a real case for there actually being this thing called truth, right? There are verifiable facts out there that's, we have to get away from this sort of misapplication of that term. So to answer your question about free speech, yeah, what we're seeing now is this sort of argument that people should be allowed to say, whatever way they want. And that, of course, is the sort of basic principle of free speech. We know that people can, get up on a soapbox on the street corner and, start saying whatever they want to. But of course, there are limits to free speech. There's certainly limits to the effects of free speech. You can't, make threats to people, for example, right? That's potentially illegal. And so I think that it really is a big challenge. And of course, this got played out in the pandemic where there was misinformation that was being circulated. And so the free speech argument was, well, people should just be allowed to say what they want to say. But if what people were saying was leading to unhealthy practices, whether it's not getting vaccinated or, taking ivermectin instead of antiviral medication, what is the responsibility of a government or a society to regulate that speech? Personally, I think that there is a role for content moderation. Not to mention that a place like Twitter or Facebook, I mean, those are private companies. Those aren't a public street corner. So I think it's perfectly within the bounds of that company to decide what ends up on that platform as well. Of course, now what we've seen now is the emergence of these other platforms, right? Then Trump came up with Truth Social, or now there's these other more conservative leaning ones. Ooh, and then look, Elon Musk bought Twitter. Now we have this thing called X, which has very palpably shifted in terms of its sort of tone and the content of what's there. And that again speaks to this informational ecosystem we live in, where there are really these very disparate views that are being put out there as the alleged truth.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. And I know there's no easy solution to how information is disseminated and regulated. So I appreciate your taking a crack at talking about that. And you talk a bit about this really sort of fascinating example of Finland as a model of way of navigating this misinformation war, for lack of a better way to put it. Like, what's Finland doing? Could you describe that for a bit?
Yeah, well, to start, Finland recognized, I think it was at least a decade or more so ago, that misinformation was really a public health problem, a problem that affected their society. And the leadership of Finland at the time really appealed to the citizenry and said, look, this is something we need to do about. We all need to get on board with this. And they really began a pretty vast educational campaign. And, we talked earlier about, teaching kids, but Finland took the enlightened approach and said, this isn't a problem of kids, only kids, I should say. This is a problem across the lifespan. There's some evidence, for example, that older people are actually even worse at navigating online information. So they really started this, I'll call it a public health campaign, but it occurred in the classroom. It occurred, for older people as well, to really teach people, how do you recognize misinformation when you see it, whether it's online or other spaces? Really teaching those analytical thinking skills. How do you slow down? How do you digest information? And they've really had a lot of success, measurable success. They've looked at polls measuring public's rating of information, comparing what they're doing in Finland to, say, here in the US, and really showing that they are a more enlightened group of consumers when it comes to information. So on the one hand, I think it often seems like this daunting, insurmountable task. Like, how do we teach people to be better consumers of information? But it can be done. Canada, for example, has this public health campaign that's called something like Think Before You Click. Again, analytical thinking. Think about what the informational source is before you share it. And for a while, some of the social media sites like Twitter were, because I know it happened to me a couple of times. I was about to click the share button, or I did click the share button, and I got a little alert that said, are you sure you want to share this, or would you like to read the article first? Right? Unfortunately, what we've seen just in the past couple of months, though, is the social media companies have taken a 180-degree turn in the other direction, so that those that had this sort of built-in fact checking have largely eliminated that. I think that one about, have you read this before you want to share it is also gone. So we're really, unfortunately, moving in the opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some ways that we can do this, and other countries have done this.
There's a fun story that you talked about in the book. It might have been earlier on in the book and in the first few chapters, but you talked about getting into a fight or an argument with somebody at a summer camp when you were younger. And I think they made you stand on either sides of the tree and put your arms around the tree. And you were kind of talking about that in the context of like, what do people, should they approach conflict resolution and talking through differences? And I'm also thinking this idea of turncoat debates. And could you say a little bit about this? Like how, like we obviously people disagree and people have disagreements. They can turn into fights. They can become heated. How is this story sort of like highlighting your thoughts about this subject?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other anecdote that I tell in that story that's very topical to your question is what I have this very distinct memory of being in high school and taking a class where we were supposed to engage in these debates with our classmates, and you'd be assigned a topic, right? You debate this side of the issue, you debate this one. And I just rapidly became so disillusioned with that, because what I saw happening is that our grades were dependent on sticking to our arguments, trying to convince the other person that I'm right and you're wrong. And like, for example, I felt that I had made this excellent argument, but then my, quote unquote opponent, who was a good friend of mine, just didn't acknowledge it or back down. And it was like, well, of course they didn't, because then they probably wouldn't get a good grade in the class.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of what I mean is, like, we do live in this, I guess I'll call it in a society where we're really primed to want to prove that we're right, to argue with the other person, to show that we're wrong. That happens more in online spaces where we're not face to face. So to bring that full circle to my anecdote about getting in a fight in summer camp, yeah, like it's so easy to get into these disputes with someone when we're not face to face. I talk about this, what do I call it? Something like the online road rage effect,
Yeah.
right? This idea that having anonymity and being able to hide behind your computer and maybe have a false name or a false picture, people just start spewing all kinds of ridiculousness. But if we actually sit face to face with one another and have a discussion, that's a very different thing. And so if we are having a dispute, rather than holding hands around a tree, which is what I had to do in summer camp, I offered this sort of counter idea of like, well, why don't we assign those two people to a task, right? And that's where I think people get past these sort of silly arguments and disputes, when they have this unified goal and you're sort of forced to work together, which in theory is what like politics is supposed to be all about,
Yeah.
right? Or Congress and those sorts of things. But that's really not what we're seeing, right? We sort of see an abandonment of that sort of collaboration or reaching across the aisle kind of thing.
Well, the politicians have social media now. So it's very easy for them to do their flaming and do their little quips and sound
Yeah.
bites. So they're like everybody else, I suppose, in that sense. So along this same line of discussion, you talked a bit in your book about this documentary you worked on, Behind the Curve. I don't know if you want to say a few words about that. You can if you'd like to. But in that, though, you talked about this idea of like, how do you approach people who have conspiracy theories or talk about things which you blatantly know are wrong, like the flat earthers, the people who believe the earth is flat. And what are sort of like the best strategies for engaging people like that? Obviously, when you pretty much know you have the facts to disprove it, I'm assuming like getting into a direct argument of confrontation is not going to help very much. So
Yeah, I mean, I think for people like you and me who work with people with mental health issues and do psychotherapy, this is sort of like psychotherapy 101, right? Like we don't get in there and work with a depressed patient and say, well, you're wrong. You're not a loser and you're not an unattractive person. Just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and like change your thinking. No, like the process of therapy starts with, oftentimes many sessions. If you're doing dynamic therapy, it could even be many months of really getting to know the person, to establish a therapeutic relationship, to establish trust. And then and only then can you start then trying to chip away at the cognitive distortions or the false beliefs or that kind of thing. So people all the time ask me, one of the most frequent questions I get is what you just said, like, how do I talk to so and so about some belief they have, whether it's QAnon or some political belief. And what I always say, first thing I say is, well, like, what's your goal? And oftentimes the goal is, oh, well, I want to change their minds. And I'm like, well, you're kind of stuck then because you can't just jump in with that. You got to start by I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to listen with understanding and compassion and even be open to like maybe if I listen to you, I'll change my mind rather than like, how do I change the person's mind? So you have to have that trusting relationship first. You have to be able to have discussions about like, well, where did you hear that? And, where do I get my information from if we ever hope to get people to change their beliefs?
yeah, and that's definitely true with false beliefs. And I'm sure you learned early on, as I did in my clinical work, that trying to argue somebody out of their delusions, if they actually have frank delusions, is just damn near impossible. And so that approach just never works.
Yeah, I tell one of my favorite jokes, and it's not my joke, but I tell the familiar joke in the book about this riddle that says, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? Right. And the answer, of course, is just one, but the light bulb has to really want to change.
Yeah,
So, it's
right.
one thing when we're doing therapy with help seeking people. We're there because they want to be there and they want to make some change. And maybe they don't want to change their belief, but maybe they have some other thing that's affecting them. And then, that's sort of a CBT principle, right? That maybe it's the belief that is actually leading to the other misery. So at least we can get there eventually. But when we're talking about, people with conspiracy theory beliefs or our ideological opposites or our political, opponents, quote unquote, those aren't people who are coming to us seeking help, right? So some of those psychotherapeutic techniques can be helpful, but it's like the light bulbs don't really want to change, right? They're not there to get their beliefs modified. What they're there to do is have the discussions where they want you to change your mind, or tell me that I'm right and you're wrong, that kind of.
So, one thing I wanted to ask you about briefly, just because we're living in this age of artificial intelligence and AI just seems to be infusing itself into just about everything these days. Any thoughts on sort of the emergence of AI and the trajectory of that and this topic of false beliefs and consumption of information? Just off the cuff, like nothing
Yeah,
specific. Like,
yeah.
what thoughts do you have about AI in the space?
No, I definitely think about this a lot. I mean, I'll start by saying that I think people sort of fundamentally don't understand what quote unquote AI is, particularly when we start talking about things like Chat GPT, or I forget the name of the program, but the one that, turns out all the pictures where you can type in, I want to see Trump as a, MMA fighter, and it
Yeah.
generates this picture. What those are basically mining information. So ChatGPT is, a LLM. It's this linear language model that basically just the algorithms can predict if you ask a question what a logical answer would be. So it's not AI in terms of like thinking in the same way that a human being thinks. So I think we have to understand, first of all, what that product really is, quote unquote AI. And incidentally, we were talking about Finland and educational programs. I will plug a university course up at the University of Washington called callingbullshit.org. I reference that in the book. Those two professors, Jevin West and Carl Bergstrom, just put out something about AI called, let's see, I think it's called bullshitmachines.org, which is an excellent primer on what are these products, what are these AI products. So with that said, my initial take, off the cuff take on AI is I'm very, very worried about the reliability of the information. I mean, we already now see across most social media platforms, we used to just type something in Google and okay, now I'm going to get 50 hits and I can select. But now at the top of that feed, there's this sort of distilled AI answer. And in fact, there's a similar program now that's used to give medical information.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there are some healthcare professionals who are using that. Well, I toyed around with it a couple times and I was pretty shocked to see that some of the information there really did not seem reliable. And then when I tried to dial down and say, like, what was the source? I clicked on the source and it was something that like really shouldn't have been in there as a reliable source at all. So I do have very serious concerns, and I'll tell what I think is an interesting anecdote. I happened to stumble upon just last night a YouTube video that was providing a review of my book, and I hadn't heard about it. No one had contacted me, so that was really interesting. And I clicked on it, and it was these two people kind of going back and forth with this, very free-flowing repartee about the book. And I have to say, I was pretty impressed by the level of detail that they were referring what I had written in my book. I've read other reviews where it seemed clear to me that the author hadn't read my book at all. But in this one, it was like, no, they had really read it. But as I continued to listen, the language was very stilted, and I ultimately realized that they weren't two people at all. This was an AI program that was discussing my book, and sure enough, while much of it was spot on, there were things that they were talking about that were in my book that were not in my book at all.
Uh-huh. Right.
So that to me is sort of my concerns about AI. It's not to a level of sophistication where we can really be very confident that the information that it tells us is very reliable. And particularly if we start asking for information about medical care or that kind of thing, and we've seen those kind of headlines about, the AI that tells somebody to drive into a lake, or says that 1+1 isn't 2, it's 5. There are these problems with AI, at least as it stands at the moment.
Right, yeah. Well, you're in trouble when they're doing the review of your book and they at the end they say, "Well, Dr. Pierre recommends a lobotomy with these false." Like, what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So right, there's obviously there's a lot of danger there, and even before AI, people were taking to the internet to diagnose themselves and come up with their treatments, and so now the presumed legitimacy of AI makes that even more striking. Joe, this has been like a super fascinating conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and this topic is amazing. What's the main thing that you would like people to take away from your book, False? What would it be?
Well, gosh, I thought probably already made that point, which is just that I think we really do have to get away from a sort of us and them mentality, right? That there's all these people with these false beliefs and something's wrong with them. And so to me, the really message is, again, that we all have this universal vulnerability. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that there isn't a significant imbalance in false belief that straddles politics right now. But I view that less an issue of the consumer, the individual person, and more an issue of the misinformation piece and what information is coming top down to people, and therefore they believe it because it's coming from those sources. So it's kind of a both things at the same time, right? We're all vulnerable to this, although there does happen to be some asymmetry right now, specifically around some beliefs that I really care about, like related to healthcare and things like that.
For sure. So your book, False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True, I assume is available on Amazon.com. Any other places where people can go if they're interested in you and your work? What's your best spots for people to find you?
Well, I guess you could put a Google search in and things will come up, but who knows what will actually come up.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
on
Right.
a more serious note, I do have a personal website. It's Dr. Joe Pierre, DrJoePierre.com. There's information about the book there. There's information about my academic work and some of the other work I do in the mental health field. So that's a good place to find more information about me and the book.
Great, Joe. It's been great having you on this episode, and it's great to see you.
All right. Well, thanks again for having me back. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Mind Tricks Radio. I hope you have enjoyed the program. For more information about Mind Tricks, please go to my website, www.waikikihealth.com. Please be sure to subscribe to Mind Tricks podcast and accompanying blog to be notified of new episodes of Mind Tricks. Please be sure to follow Mind Tricks on Facebook by following and liking posts by myself, your host, Dr. Aaron Kaplan.